This story provides English listening practice. It focuses on emotional vocabulary and the life lesson that true courage often requires breaking the mold. Let's begin. I lived my life like a metronome. Every morning started at exactly 6 o'clock with the sharp beep of my alarm. I drank 1 cup of black coffee while standing at the kitchen counter. I ironed my white blouse until the fabric was crisp enough to cut the air. My drive to the community college took exactly 15 minutes. I parked in the same spot, third from the left, under the shade of the old oak tree. I walked to my classroom, unlocked the door, and wrote the date on the whiteboard in neat block letters. This was my world. It was safe. It was predictable. It was a silent fortress built on rules and routine. I was 34 years old, and I had never made a mistake that could not be fixed with an eraser. I told myself I was happy. I told myself that peace was better than passion. I was a liar. The semester began on a Tuesday in late September. The air was turning crisp, and the leaves outside my window were just starting to bleed into gold and crimson. My classroom smelled of dry erase markers and old textbooks. I stood at the front of the room, arranging my syllabus stacks, waiting for the usual drift of students to filter in. They were usually young, fresh out of high school, distracted by their phones and their new freedom. I was prepared for them. I had my boundaries ready. I had my professional voice tuned to a perfect, distant pitch. Then the door opened, and the rhythm of my metronome skipped a beat. Ethan Miller walked in. He was not fresh out of high school. He was older, perhaps in his early 20s, with shoulders that filled the doorframe and eyes that seemed to hold too much history for a classroom. He did not slump into a chair in the back row. He walked to the front, placed a leather notebook on the desk directly in front of mine, and looked at me. He did not look at me like a student looks at a teacher. He looked at me like a person looks at a puzzle they are determined to solve. He introduced himself with a voice that was low and steady, a sound that vibrated against the quiet air of the room. He told me he was returning to school to finish what he started. He said he wanted to learn. I nodded stiffly. I told him to take a seat. I turned my back to write a grammar rule on the board, but my hand was unsteady. The marker squeaked against the white surface. I could feel his eyes on my back. It was not a predatory gaze, but it was heavy. It was an attentive weight that I was not used to carrying. I felt a sudden, sharp awareness of the silence in the room. Usually, the silence was my shield. Now, it felt charged. It felt like the air before a storm. I cleared my throat and began my lecture on sentence structure. I talked about subjects and predicates. I talked about how things must agree. I talked about rules. Throughout the hour, Ethan did not check a phone. He did not look out the window. He watched me. When I asked a question, he answered. His answers were not just correct, they were thoughtful. He asked why the rules existed. He asked if the rules ever changed depending on the context. He made the simple act of learning English feel like a philosophical debate. I felt my professional mask slipping. Just a fraction. I found myself explaining not just the times how asterisk, but the times why asterisk. I found myself meeting his gaze and holding it a second too long. When the class ended, the other students rushed out, eager for lunch or freedom. Ethan took his time. He packed his bag slowly. He walked up to my desk. He did not ask about the homework. He asked me if I ever got tired of being right all the time. The question was personal. It was a violation of the boundary I had drawn. It should have offended me. Instead, it struck a chord deep inside my chest, a string that had not been played in years. I told him that being right was the only way to be safe. He smiled then. It was a small, sad smile that made him look older and younger at the same time. He said that safety was a cage. He said he preferred the risk. He left the room, and I was alone again. The silence rushed back in. But it was different now. The air felt thin. My heart was beating against my ribs like a trapped bird. I looked at the empty desk where he had sat. I looked at the whiteboard where my neat block letters suddenly seemed rigid and suffocating. I went through the rest of my day, but the rhythm was gone. The metronome was broken. I drove home, but the road felt longer. I drank my evening tea, but it tasted tasteless. I sat in my quiet living room and realized that for the first time in a decade, I was afraid of the quiet. I was afraid because I knew something had shifted. I knew that the man with the dark eyes and the dangerous questions had not just walked into my classroom. He had walked into the fortress I had built to keep the world out. He didn't ruin my life. He woke it up. And that's what scared me. My apartment was located on the 3rd floor of a brick building that smelled of floor wax and old mail. It was a space designed for one person. I had a single gray armchair positioned by the window. I had a small dining table with 2 chairs, though the second chair was only used to hold my graded papers. My evenings were a scripted performance of solitude. I would arrive home at 5 o'clock. I would change out of my work clothes and into soft, shapeless loungewear. I would cook a simple meal, usually roasted vegetables, and a piece of chicken. I would eat in silence, listening to the hum of the refrigerator. This silence was not empty to me. It was heavy, like a protective blanket. It kept the chaos of the world at bay. In this silence, I was not a lonely woman in her 30s. I was a professional. I was independent. I was safe. But after that first Tuesday, the silence began to feel different. It began to feel like a waiting room. I found myself pacing the length of my living room rug. I found myself checking the clock on the microwave, counting the hours until the sun rose. I told myself it was just insomnia. I told myself I needed to buy new pillows. But deep down, beneath the layers of denial, I had carefully applied like varnish. I knew the truth. I was waiting for the next class. I was waiting to see if the anomaly would return. I was waiting for Ethan. He came back. He came back every Tuesday and Thursday. He sat in the same seat, front row, center. He did not bring a backpack like the others. He brought only that leather notebook and a black pen. The other students shifted in their seats, checked their phones, and whispered about weekend parties. Ethan sat with a stillness that was unnerving. When I spoke, he watched my mouth. When I turned to write on the board, I could feel his gaze tracing the line of my spine. It made my skin prickle. It made me conscious of the way my skirt moved, the way my hair fell, the way my chalk tapped against the slate. I had spent 10 years making myself invisible, hiding behind the role of the teacher. Ethan saw me. He did not see the role. He saw the woman hiding inside the suit. One afternoon, 3 weeks into the term, the lesson was on modal verbs. We were discussing possibility, necessity, and obligation. I wrote the words, times must asterisk, asterisk, should asterisk, and times might times on the board. I asked the class for examples. A girl in the back raised her hand and said she times must times study to pass. A boy said he times should times call his mother. Then, I looked at Ethan. The room seemed to dim around him. He leaned back in his chair, his long legs stretched out, crossing at the ankles. He said that people, times might times break the rules if the rules were wrong. I froze. My hand gripped the marker tight enough to turn my knuckles white. I asked him to elaborate, keeping my voice clipped and academic. I used my teacher voice, the one that discouraged personal tangents. He did not back down. He said that some rules are just habits disguised as laws. He said that sometimes we do what we times should times do, and we lose who we times might times be. He looked directly at me when he said it. The air in the room grew heavy and hot. My chest tightened. It was not a grammar example. It was an interrogation of my entire existence. I quickly moved to the next slide. I changed the subject to the past perfect tense. I ran back to the safety of history, where things were already finished and could not hurt me. But my heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. After class, I stayed at my desk, aggressively organizing papers that were already organized. I wanted him to leave. I needed him to leave, so I could breathe. The other students filed out, a stream of noise and color. The room emptied. The quiet returned. I looked up, expecting to be alone. Ethan was standing in the doorway. He was leaning against the frame, his arms crossed over his chest. He was wearing a dark blue sweater that made his eyes look like deep water. He asked if he had upset me. I lied. I told him no. I told him I was just tired. I told him that his example was creative, but off topic. I tried to sound dismissive. I tried to sound like a busy instructor with no time for student philosophy. He pushed off the doorframe and took a step into the room. The space between us shrank. He said he did not think I was tired. He said he thought I was bored. He said he thought I was teaching a language I knew perfectly, but never actually used to say anything real. The accusation stung. It was sharp and precise. I stood up, placing my hands on the desk to steady myself. I told him that was inappropriate. I told him there were boundaries he needed to respect. I used the word times, boundaries, times like a shield. He stopped moving. He looked at me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he apologized. He said he didn't mean to be disrespectful. He said he just wanted to know who I was when the bell rang. He turned and walked away. I listened to his footsteps fade down the hallway. I sat back down in my chair and realized my hands were shaking. I was 34 years old. I had a master's degree. I had a retirement fund. I had a plan. And a 21-year-old student had just dismantled my composure with 3 sentences. The next week, the rain began. It was a cold, relentless October rain that turned the campus into a gray blur. I arrived at my office early, seeking the sanctuary of my locked door. I had grading to do. I had emails to answer. I had to report midterm grades. I buried myself in the bureaucracy of my job. I focused on attendance sheets and syllabus adjustments. I tried to forget the way he had looked at me. I tried to forget the sound of his voice. But the mind is a traitor. Every time I read a student essay, I found myself looking for his name. When I found it, my pulse would jump. His handwriting was jagged and hurried, pressing hard into the paper. His essays were raw. He wrote about his family, about growing up fast, about the feeling of losing time. Reading his words felt like eavesdropping on his soul. It felt intimate in a way that terrified me. I sat in my office with the rain lashing against the window, holding his paper in my hands. I should have marked the comma splices. I should have corrected the run-on sentences. Instead, I found myself tracing the loops of his letters. I found myself wondering what his hands looked like when he wrote this. I slammed the paper down on the desk. I was crossing a line. I knew the code of conduct. I knew the ethics. A teacher does not fantasize about a student. A woman in her 30s does not yearn for a boy who is barely an adult. It was wrong. It was dangerous. It was a cliché. I scolded myself harsh and loud in the empty room. I told myself to grow up. I told myself to stop. But stopping is impossible when you are starving. And I was starving. I had been starving for years, feeding myself on scraps of politeness and professional courtesy. Ethan offered a feast of attention. He noticed things no one else did. One Thursday, I wore a scarf with a small tear in the fabric. I thought no one would see it. Ethan saw it. He asked if I had caught it on something. He asked if it was my favorite scarf. He asked if I knew how to mend things. The questions were simple, but the subtext was screaming. He was paying attention to the details of me. He was mapping my existence. I started to change. It was subtle at first. I bought a lipstick that was a shade brighter than my usual pale pink. I left my hair down one day instead of tying it back in my severe bun. I started listening to music in my car instead of the news. I told myself these were small acts of self-care. I lied to myself. I was preening. I was a flower turning its face toward the only source of sun. I was dressing for him. The realization made me sick with guilt. I would look in the bathroom mirror and see a stranger staring back, a woman with flushed cheeks and bright eyes. A woman who looked alive. I hated her. I loved her. We had a conference scheduled. It was standard procedure. Every student had to meet with me to discuss their midterm project. I dreaded his appointment. I prepared for it, like a general preparing for battle. I left the office door wide open. I sat behind my desk, creating a physical barrier. I had a list of talking points ready. I would discuss his thesis statement. I would discuss his citation format. I would keep it dry. I would keep it safe. He arrived exactly on time. He was wet from the rain. His hair was dark and damp, curling slightly at the ends. He wore a heavy coat that smelled of damp wool and cold air. He sat down, and the small office suddenly felt microscopic. The scent of the rain and him filled the space. I started talking immediately. I rattled off my critique of his outline. I pointed out structural errors. I talked fast, filling the air with words so there would be no room for silence. He listened quietly. He nodded. He took notes. When I finished, I asked if he had any questions about the assignment. He closed his notebook. He looked at the open door, then back at me. He asked why I was afraid of the quiet. The question hit me like a physical blow. I opened my mouth to defend myself, to tell him to stay on topic. But the words died in my throat. He leaned forward. His voice dropped to a murmur, barely audible over the sound of the rain outside. He said he noticed that I filled every second with noise. He said he noticed that I never stood still. He asked what I was running from. I could have reported him. I could have ended the meeting right there. I could have told him to leave and never come back. But I didn't. I looked at him, and for the first time, I let the mask drop. I let him see the exhaustion in my eyes. I let him see the loneliness. I told him that silence was where the ghosts lived. It was a strange thing to say. It was too poetic. It was too honest. But it slipped out. Ethan did not laugh. He did not look confused. He nodded slowly, as if I had confirmed something he already knew. He said that ghosts only haunt you if you are afraid of them. He said that sometimes silence is just a place to rest. He looked at my hands, which were clenched on top of his paper. He did not touch me. He did not move closer. But the intimacy of the moment was so intense it felt like a touch. It felt like he had reached across the desk and held my hand. The clock on the wall ticked loudly. The rain drummed against the glass. We sat in that shared silence for 10 seconds, 20 seconds, 30 seconds. It was the longest minute of my life. It was terrifying. It was electric. I knew then that I was in trouble. I knew that the professional boundary I clung to was made of glass, and he was holding a stone. I ended the meeting abruptly. I stood up and told him I had another appointment. It was a lie. He knew it was a lie. He stood up slowly. He gathered his things. At the door, he paused. He looked back at me. He didn't say goodbye. He said, "See you Tuesday, Clara." He used my first name. He had never done that before. It hung in the air, forbidden and sweet. I did not correct him. I watched him walk away, down the long, empty corridor. I closed my office door. I locked it. I leaned my forehead against the cool wood and closed my eyes. I whispered his name into the empty room. Asterisk Ethan. Asterisk It tasted like danger. It tasted like a promise. I went home that night, and the silence of my apartment felt unbearable. The metronome was gone. The rhythm was gone. There was only the rain, and the memory of his voice, and the terrifying realization that I did not want to be safe anymore. I wanted to be seen. I began to see him everywhere, not just in the classroom. I saw him in the library, his head bent over a book. I saw him in the cafeteria, laughing with a group of students who looked like children next to him. I saw him walking across the quad, his stride long and purposeful. I was haunting him as much as he was haunting me. I was the teacher, the authority figure, the adult. I was supposed to be the one in control, but I felt like a leaf caught in a current, spinning faster and faster toward a waterfall I could not see. One evening, I stayed late on campus to attend a faculty meeting. It dragged on for hours. By the time I left, the campus was dark and deserted. The street lamps cast long yellow pools of light on the wet pavement. I walked to my car, my heels clicking loudly on the concrete. I felt a sudden wave of unease. The shadows seemed too deep. The wind was too cold. I fumbled for my keys, my fingers stiff. Need a light? The voice came from the darkness near the oak tree. I jumped, dropping my keys. Ethan stepped out of the shadows. He held up his phone, the flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. He bent down and picked up my keys. He did not hand them to me immediately. He held them in his palm, looking at the silver medal. He asked why I was here so late. I told him about the meeting. My voice was breathless, high-pitched. He nodded. He stepped closer. He handed me the keys. His fingers brushed against mine. The contact was brief, a fraction of a second. But it sent a shock wave up my arm that settled in my chest. He waited while I unlocked the car. He waited while I got in. He waited until I started the engine. He stood there in the cold, watching over me, a silent guardian in the dark. I drove away, my hands gripping the steering wheel so hard my fingers ached. I looked in the rearview mirror. He was still standing there, a dark silhouette against the yellow light. He was not just a student. He was not just a boy. He was the only real thing in my paper world, and I was falling in love with him. The realization was not warm. It was cold. It was terrifying. It was a disaster waiting to happen, and I was driving straight into it, with my eyes wide open. The Tuesday following our encounter in the parking lot was a masterclass in avoidance. I arrived on campus an hour early, to ensure I would not run into anyone in the hallway. I brewed my coffee in the staff lounge, and stared at the beige walls, willing my heartbeat to slow down to a resting pace. I told myself that the moment in the parking lot was nothing. It was a student helping a teacher. It was a common courtesy. It was darkness and shadows playing tricks on a tired mind. I repeated these sentences like a mantra. I built a wall of rational thought, brick by brick, until I felt steady enough to unlock my classroom door. When Ethan walked in, the wall crumbled. He did not wave. He did not smile. He simply walked to his seat in the front row, sat down, and looked at me. His gaze was different now. It was no longer just curious. It was knowing. It was as if we shared a secret language that consisted entirely of silence. During the lecture, I fumbled my words. I wrote a sentence on the board and misspelled a simple word. I heard the scratch of his pen on paper, and it sounded like thunder in the quiet room. I avoided looking at him for an hour. I focused on the students in the back row. I focused on the clock. I focused on the dust motes dancing in the projector light. But I could feel him. It was a physical sensation, like heat radiating from a fire. When the class ended, I busied myself with my laptop, refusing to look up until the room was empty. When I finally lifted my head, he was gone. But on the corner of my desk, there was a small, folded piece of paper. I opened it. It was not a note. It was a drawing. It was a sketch of a bird sitting on a wire, looking down at the ground. There were no words. Just the bird, and the wire, and the drop. I put the paper in my pocket, and it felt heavy, like a stone. The weather turned against me the following week. The autumn storms rolled in with a vengeance, turning the sky a bruised purple, and drowning the town in sheets of gray rain. It was the kind of rain that soaked through coats and chilled the bones. On Thursday evening, I stayed late to finish grading midterm papers. The heating in the building had been turned down, and I was shivering in my office, wrapped in my coat. I lost track of time. When I finally looked at the clock, it was past 8. The building was silent. The corridors were dark tunnels of shadow. I packed my bag and walked out to the parking lot, my umbrella fighting a losing battle against the wind. I reached my car and turned the key. Nothing happened. The engine gave a pathetic click and then fell silent. I tried again. Click. Silence. The battery was dead. I sat there in the driver's seat, the rain hammering against the roof, and I wanted to cry. It was such a small thing, a dead battery, but it felt like the final straw. It felt like the universe was laughing at my carefully ordered life. I was 34 years old, and I was stranded in the dark, cold, and alone. I pulled out my phone to call a roadside service, but the signal was weak. The call failed. I stared at the screen, watching the battery icon turn red. I was trapped. Then, headlights swept across my windshield. A truck pulled up beside me, the engine idling with a low rumble. The window rolled down. It was Ethan. He didn't ask what was wrong. He didn't ask if I needed help. He just looked at my car, then at me, and told me to pop the hood. He got out into the pouring rain without hesitation. He wasn't wearing a coat, just a flannel shirt that was instantly soaked darker by the deluge. I watched him through the wet glass as he leaned over my engine. He moved with a competence that was mesmerizing. He checked the connections. He wiped something down. He came back to my window, water dripping from his hair onto his eyelashes. He told me the battery was completely dead and the cables looked corroded. He said he couldn't jump it tonight. He said I wasn't going anywhere in this car. He told me to get in his truck. It wasn't a question. It was a command delivered with a calm certainty that left no room for argument. I grabbed my bag and ran through the rain, climbing into the passenger seat of his vehicle. The cab was warm. It smelled of old leather, coffee, and rain. The heater was blasting, blowing hot air onto my frozen hands. Ethan climbed in the driver's side, shaking the water from his hair like a wet dog. He looked at me and smiled. It was the first, genuine, unguarded smile I had seen from him. He asked for my address. I gave it to him. I should have asked him to drop me at a taxi stand. I should have called a friend. But I gave him my address. The drive was 20 minutes. For the first 5 minutes, neither of us spoke. The only sounds were the rhythmic slap of the windshield wipers and the hum of the tires on the wet asphalt. The space inside the truck felt intimate. It was a small, enclosed world, separate from the storm outside. I was acutely aware of his presence next to me. I was aware of his hands on the steering wheel, his knuckles slightly white, his forearm flexing as he turned a corner. I was aware of the wet flannel clinging to his chest. He broke the silence. He asked me how long I had been teaching. I told him 8 years. He asked if I liked it. I gave him my standard answer about shaping young minds and the importance of language. He laughed softly. He said he didn't ask for the brochure. He asked if I liked times it. The question stripped away my script. I looked out the window at the blurred lights passing by. I told him the truth. I told him I liked the order of it. I liked the rules. I liked that there was a right answer and a wrong answer. He glanced at me. The dashboard lights cast a soft green glow on his face. He asked what happened when there wasn't a right answer. He asked what happened when the rules didn't fit. I told him that was why I taught grammar, not poetry. In grammar, the rules always fit. He shook his head. He said that was the saddest thing he had ever heard. He said that poetry was where the life was. He said that poetry was the mess, and the mess was the point. We pulled up to my apartment building. He put the truck in park but didn't unlock the doors immediately. The rain was softer now, a gentle tapping on the metal roof. We sat there, suspended in the moment. The air between us was thick, charged with unspoken words. I knew I should thank him and leave. I knew I should open the door and run up the stairs to my safe, silent fortress. But I couldn't move. I didn't want to move. I wanted to stay in this warm, leather-scented cab with him forever. He turned in his seat to face me. His eyes searched mine. He reached out, his hand hovering for a second before he brushed a stray lock of wet hair away from my face. His fingers grazed my cheek. The touch was electric. It was fire and ice. My breath hitched in my throat. I froze, my eyes wide, staring at him. He didn't pull away. He let his hand linger near my jawline. He whispered that I didn't have to be so scared of the mess. He whispered that sometimes the mess was beautiful. My heart was hammering so hard I thought he could hear it. I wanted to lean into his hand. I wanted to close the distance between us. Every alarm bell in my head was ringing. Every rule I had ever followed was screaming at me to run. I forced myself to pull back. I mumbled a thank you. I fumbled for the door handle. I opened the door and stepped out into the cold night air. I didn't look back until I was inside the building lobby. When I turned, his truck was still there. He waited until I was safe inside, until the lights of my apartment turned on, before he drove away. I stood by my window, watching his taillights disappear around the corner, and I felt a profound sense of loss. I touched my cheek where his fingers had been. My skin felt branded. The dynamic shifted after that night. We didn't talk about the car ride. We didn't talk about the touch. But everything changed. The barrier between teacher and student, which had already been cracking, shattered completely. We just pretended the shards weren't there. We entered a phase of dangerous normalcy. He started staying after class, not for 5 minutes, but for 20, then 30. We moved from the classroom to the small bench outside the humanities building. It was public, yet we created a private bubble around us. We talked about everything except the curriculum. He told me about his family. He told me about his father, who had left when he was 10, and his mother, who worked 2 jobs to keep the lights on. He told me about the year he spent working on a fishing boat in Alaska, about the cold and the exhaustion and the beauty of the ocean at dawn. He spoke with a raw honesty that made my own life feel like a black and white movie. In return, I gave him pieces of myself I had not looked at in years. I told him about my childhood dream of being a writer. I told him about the novel I had started and abandoned 3 times. I told him about my fear of failure, my fear of being ordinary. He listened with an intensity that made me feel like the most interesting person in the world. He didn't just listen. He remembered. A week after I mentioned I loved hazelnut coffee, he walked into my office hours with 2 cups. One was black, one was hazelnut. He placed it on my desk without a word. It was a small gesture, costing less than $5, but it felt more intimate than a bouquet of roses. It was proof that he knew me. It was proof that he was thinking of me when I wasn't there. I took the coffee. I drank it. It tasted like guilt and delight. The digital boundary was the next to fall. It started with a legitimate email about an assignment. He sent a draft at 10 o'clock at night. I replied with corrections at 10:15. He replied back thanking me. Then, he added a line, asterisk. P.S. You were right about the semicolons, but I still think you're wrong about Hemingway. Asterisk. I should have ignored it. I should have let it hang there. Instead, I typed back. Asterisk. Hemingway was a master of brevity. You just like adjectives too much. Asterisk. He replied instantly. Asterisk. Adjectives are feelings. Brevity is just hiding. Asterisk. We argued about literature until midnight. The emails flew back and forth, stripping away the professional distance with every timestamp. We moved from literature to philosophy, then to music, then to us. The subject lines disappeared. The formalities disappeared. It became a conversation that flowed in real time. I lay in my bed, the laptop glowing in the dark, waiting for his name to pop up on my screen. When it did, a rush of dopamine flooded my system. I was addicted. I was chatting with a student in the middle of the night, discussing the nature of loneliness. I was breaking every rule in the handbook, and I didn't care. One afternoon, I was walking towards the campus library when I saw him. He was sitting on the low stone wall near the fountain, talking to a girl. She was his age. She was pretty, with long blonde hair and a bright, easy laugh. She touched his arm as she spoke. I stopped dead in my tracks. A hot, ugly spike of jealousy pierced my chest. It was irrational. It was pathetic. I had no claim on him. I was his teacher. She was his peer. They made sense. We were a mistake. But seeing her hand on his arm made me want to scream. I turned around and walked the other way, my heels striking the pavement hard. Later that day, he came to my office. I was cold to him. I was efficient and distant. I kept my eyes on my computer screen. I asked him what he needed. He stood in front of my desk, silent for a long moment. Then he asked why I was angry. I told him I wasn't angry. I told him I was busy. He laughed, a short, humorless sound. He said I was a terrible liar for an English teacher. He said he saw me by the fountain. He said she was his lab partner. He said she meant nothing. I looked up at him, shocked by his boldness. He wasn't apologizing. He was explaining. He was reassuring me. He was acknowledging the jealousy I had tried to hide. He was acknowledging that I had at times right times to be jealous. That implication hung in the air, heavy and terrifying. He leaned his hands on my desk, leaning in close. He lowered his voice. He said that he didn't care about lab partners. He said he didn't care about anyone else on this campus. He said he only came here for one class. My breath caught. I looked at his hands on my desk. They were strong, capable hands. I remembered how they had looked fixing my car. I remembered how his fingers had felt on my cheek. I looked up at his face. His eyes were dark and intense, burning with a hunger that mirrored my own. I realized then that we were past the point of return. We were not just flirting. We were not just friends. We were two people standing on the edge of a cliff, daring the other to jump. I stood up. I walked around the desk. I told myself I was going to open the door. I told myself I was going to ask him to leave. But I didn't go to the door. I stopped in front of him. We were inches apart. I could smell the rain on his jacket. I could smell the coffee on his breath. I could feel the heat coming off his body. I looked up at him, and for a terrifying moment, I thought I was going to kiss him. I thought he was going to kiss me. The air between us crackled. The silence roared. "Ethan," I whispered. My voice was trembling. "You have to go." "Why?" he whispered back. He didn't move. He didn't back away. "Because," I said. It was a weak answer. It was no answer at all. "Because of the rules?" he asked. There was no mockery in his voice, only a gentle sadness. "Yes," I lied. "Because of the rules." He looked at me for a long time. He looked at my lips. He looked at my eyes. He nodded slowly. He stepped back. The loss of his proximity felt like a physical chill. He walked to the door. He put his hand on the knob. He turned back to me. He said that rules were just lines we drew in the sand to feel safe from the tide. He said the tide was coming anyway. He left. I sank into my chair, my legs shaking so hard they could barely support me. I put my head in my hands. I was terrified. I was exhilarated. I was in deep, dangerous trouble. And the worst part was, I couldn't wait to see him again. The weeks blurred into November. The tension became a constant hum in my life, a background noise that drowned out everything else. I went through the motions of my job. I attended meetings. I graded papers. I ate lunch. But my real life, my vivid life, only existed in the moments I was with him. We stole time. We met in the back stacks of the library, pretending to look for books, whispering about our days in the hushed gloom. We met at a small coffee shop 3 towns over, a place where no one knew us. We sat in a booth in the back, drinking tea and talking until the staff turned the chairs up on the tables. In that coffee shop, we were not teacher and student. We were just Clara and Ethan. We were 2 people who had found each other in the wreckage of the world. He made me laugh. He made me think. He made me feel beautiful. One Sunday afternoon, in that booth, he reached across the table and took my hand. It was broad daylight. People were walking by outside. Anyone could have looked in the window, but I didn't pull away. I let him lace his fingers through mine. I let him hold my hand. His palm was warm and rough. His grip was firm. I looked at our joined hands on the scarred wooden table, and I felt a surge of defiance. I wanted this. I wanted him. I didn't care about the tenure track. I didn't care about the Board of Education. I wanted his hand in mine. "You look happy," he said softly, watching my face. "I am," I admitted. The words felt strange on my tongue. "I am scared, but I am happy." "Don't be scared," he said. He squeezed my hand. "We aren't doing anything wrong. We're just 2 people. We are 2 people breaking a very big rule," I reminded him. "Is it a bad rule?" he asked. "It's a protective rule," I said. "It protects you from me. It protects me from losing my livelihood." "I don't need protection from you," he said fiercely. "And you won't lose anything. We're careful. No one knows. Someone always knows," I whispered. I looked out the window at the gray street. I had a sudden, sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach. A premonition, a shadow passing over the sun. "Secrets have a way of getting out, Ethan. Not this one," he promised. "I'll protect this. I'll protect you." I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that we existed in a vacuum, that our love was invisible to the world. But deep down, I knew better. I knew that happiness this sharp always came with a price. I looked at him, at his earnest face, at the way he looked at me like I was the only woman on earth. And I decided I would pay the price. Whatever it was, I squeezed his hand back. I smiled. I chose the danger. We left the coffee shop separately, as we always did. I walked to my car, my heart light, my mind replaying the feeling of his hand in mine. I didn't notice the black sedan parked across the street. I didn't notice the flash of a lens in the late afternoon sun. I didn't notice that the world was watching. I drove home singing along to the radio. I cooked dinner. I graded papers. I went to sleep, dreaming of his voice. The next morning, the bubble burst. I walked into the faculty lounge to get my coffee. The room went silent the moment I entered. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Heads turned, eyes averted. It was the kind of silence that screams. My stomach dropped. I walked to the coffee pot, my steps echoing loudly on the linoleum. I poured a cup, my hand shaking slightly. I turned to face the room. My colleague, Sarah, a woman I had eaten lunch with for 5 years, looked at me with a mixture of pity and disgust. "Good morning," I said, my voice sounding thin and brittle. No one answered. Sarah looked down at the table. On the table was a smartphone. The screen was lit up. It showed a photo. It was a grainy photo, taken from a distance, through a window, but it was unmistakable. It was me. It was Ethan. We were sitting in the booth. Our hands were clasped on the table. He was looking at me with that intense, undeniable adoration. I was looking at him with naked longing. The caption under the photo was short. It was brutal. Asterisk? English department extra credit? Asterisk? The air left the room. The floor seemed to tilt beneath my feet. The coffee cup slipped from my numb fingers and shattered on the floor. Brown liquid splashed across my shoes and the hem of my skirt. The sound of the breaking ceramic was like a gunshot. I stared at the mess on the floor. I stared at the phone. I stared at the faces of my colleagues. They knew. Everyone knew. The private world we had built, the safe, secret bubble, had been popped. The tide had come in, just as Ethan had predicted. But it wasn't a gentle tide. It was a tsunami. And I was standing directly in its path, with no life jacket, and no way to swim. I looked up. The department head, a stern man named Dr. Henderson, was standing in the doorway. He looked at the broken cup. He looked at me. His face was like stone. "Clara," he said. His voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of a judge's gavel. "In my office. Now." I didn't look at Sarah. I didn't look at the phone. I stepped over the shards of the coffee cup. I walked towards the door. My legs felt like lead. My heart was a cold, heavy lump in my chest. I walked past Dr. Henderson and into the hallway. The fluorescent lights seemed too bright. The noise of the students in the corridor seemed too loud. I felt exposed. I felt naked. I felt the eyes of the world on me, stripping away my dignity, my career, my life. I walked towards the executioner's office, and all I could think about was the warmth of Ethan's hand and the terrifying realization that it might be the last time I ever felt it. The walk to Dr. Henderson's office felt like a march to the gallows. The corridor, usually a blur of students and backpacks, seemed to elongate, stretching into an endless tunnel of judgment. I kept my head high, my eyes fixed on a point in the distance, but my peripheral vision was screaming. I saw the whispers. I saw the heads leaning together. I saw the glances, some curious, some scandalized, some gleeful. The photo had traveled fast. Gossip in a small academic community moves faster than light. It infects the air before you even breathe it. I entered the office. Dr. Henderson did not offer me a seat. He stood behind his large mahogany desk, a fortress of authority. On his computer screen, I saw the image. It was blown up, pixelated, but damning. My hand. His hand. The undeniable intimacy of the lean. It wasn't a crime scene photo, but in this room, it was evidence of a felony. "Clara," he began, his voice devoid of the warmth he used at holiday parties. "We have a code of conduct. It is explicit. It is non-negotiable." "It's a misunderstanding," I said. My voice was steady, a miracle of muscle memory. We were discussing a project. He was upset. I was comforting him. "Comforting him?" Henderson repeated. He clicked a key. Another photo appeared. This one was from the parking lot. Ethan standing by my car. My face turned up to his. The proximity was impossible to explain away as academic advising. And this? Was this also comfort? I went cold. Someone had been watching us for weeks. This wasn't just a random snap. This was surveillance. "Who took these?" I asked. anger momentarily overriding my fear. "It doesn't matter," Henderson said. He pushed a folder across the desk. "The board has been notified. The students' parents have been notified. This is a liability nightmare, Clara. A 34-year-old instructor, a 21-year-old undergraduate. The power dynamic alone is grounds for immediate termination." "He's an adult," I argued, clinging to the one fact that felt solid. "He's 21. He is a student," Henderson countered, his voice rising. "And you are his teacher. You grade his papers. You determine his future. You cannot hold his hand and his gradebook at the same time." He leaned forward. "You have two choices. You can resign effectively immediately, citing personal reasons. We will seal the file. You will leave quietly. Or we launch a formal investigation. We interview the student. We interview your colleagues. We make this public. And I promise you, Clara, you will never teach again." The ultimatum hung in the air like smoke. Resign and disappear, or fight and be destroyed. I looked at the photos. I looked at the man who had been my mentor. I realized I had no allies here. The institution protected itself. It did not protect people who broke the mold. "I need time," I said. "You have until 5 o'clock today," Henderson said. "Go home. Do not speak to the student. Do not go to your office. Just go." I walked out of the administration building into the blinding sunlight. It felt mocking. The world should be dark. It should be storming. I walked to my car, my phone buzzing incessantly in my pocket. I didn't check it. I knew what it was. Texts from friends asking if it was true. Texts from colleagues pretending to be concerned. And maybe, just maybe, a text from him. I drove home on autopilot. I parked. I unlocked my apartment door. The silence that greeted me was different now. It wasn't safe. It was hollow. It was the silence of a life that had been emptied out. I sat on my couch, still in my coat, and stared at the wall. I was numb. I was in shock. Then, a knock at the door. Not a polite tap. A frantic, heavy pounding. I froze. I knew who it was. I shouldn't answer. Henderson had said, "Do not speak to the student." If I opened that door, I was sealing my fate. The knocking came again. "Clara!" It was his voice. It cracked on my name. It sounded desperate. I got up. I walked to the door. I unlocked it. Ethan stumbled in. He looked wild. His hair was messy, his eyes wide and panicked. He was breathing hard, as if he had run all the way here. He slammed the door shut behind him and leaned against it, looking at me as if checking for physical wounds. "They pulled me out of class," he said, the words tumbling out. "The dean. My parents. They're talking about lawsuits. They're talking about you like you're a predator." "I know," I whispered. "It's a lie," he said fiercely. He pushed off the door and came towards me. I told them I pursued you. I told them it was mutual. I told them you never did anything wrong." "Ethan, stop," I said, holding up a hand. "It doesn't matter who pursued who. The rule is the rule." "Screw the rule," he shouted. The violence of his voice made me flinch. He saw it and stopped. He took a deep breath, visibly trying to calm himself. He reached out and took my hands. His grip was painful. "Clara, listen to me. Let's leave." I stared at him. "What?" "Let's go," he said, his eyes burning with a terrifying hope. "Pack a bag. We get in my truck. We drive. We go west. We go north. It doesn't matter. We just leave this poisonous little town and their cameras and their rules. We start over." It was a beautiful, reckless fantasy. For a second, I let myself live in it. I saw us on the road, the wind in our hair, free. I saw us in a small cabin, drinking coffee, laughing. I saw a life where I didn't have to be afraid. But then I looked at him. Really looked at him. He was 21. He had 3 semesters left of college. He had a family who loved him. Even if they were angry right now, he had a future. If he ran away with me, he would be the boy who threw his life away for a teacher. He would be the scandal. He would carry that baggage forever. And I would be the woman who stole him. I loved him. I loved him enough to want him. But I loved him more than that. I loved him enough to let him go. I pulled my hands away. I stepped back. I summoned the teacher voice one last time. It was the hardest acting performance of my life. "No, Ethan," I said cold. He looked struck. "What?" "We are not going anywhere," I said. "This is not a movie. This is real life. You have a degree to finish. You have a life here." "I don't care about that," he pleaded. "I care about you. And I care about you," I said. "That's why I'm doing this. You need to go home. You need to apologize to the dean. You need to say that you were confused. That it was a mistake." "It wasn't a mistake," he whispered. Tears were welling in his eyes. It broke me to see them. "You have to say it was," I said. My voice wavered, but I forced it steady. "You have to save yourself, Ethan, because I'm already gone." "Don't say that," he said. He reached for me again. I stepped back further. "I'm resigning. I'm leaving town. Alone." "You can't," he said. "You love me. I know you do." "I was your teacher," I said harsh. "It was inappropriate. It was a lapse in judgment. And now it's over." I lied. I lied to his face to save him. I watched the light go out of his eyes. I watched the hope turn to confusion, and then to hurt. He looked at me like I had stabbed him. "You don't mean that," he said. "I do," I said. "Please leave, before the police come." He stood there for a long, agonizing minute. He searched my face for a sign, a crack, a signal that this was a ruse. I gave him nothing. I gave him stone. Finally, he nodded. A small, jerky movement. He turned around. He opened the door. He walked out. He didn't look back. I closed the door. I locked it. And then I slid down to the floor and screamed. I screamed into my hands so the neighbors wouldn't hear. I cried until my chest ached, until my throat was raw. I had done the right thing. I had done the noble thing, and it felt like dying. I resigned via email at 4:55 p.m. I packed my apartment in 2 days. I sold the furniture I couldn't carry. I didn't say goodbye to anyone. I got in my car, the same car he had fixed, and I drove. I drove until the mountains turned into flatlands, and the flatlands turned into coast. I rented a small, drafty cottage in a town where the wind smelled of salt and fish. I became a ghost. 6 months passed. My life became a new kind of routine. I didn't teach. I couldn't. The thought of a classroom made me sick. I found work as a freelance editor, fixing other people's broken sentences online. I worked at a kitchen table that overlooked a gray, churning ocean. I walked on the beach in the evenings, wearing a thick coat, watching the waves crash against the rocks. The noise of the ocean helped. It drowned out the silence in my head. I didn't hear from him. I didn't look for him. I blocked the college website. I deleted my social media. I severed every tie, but I couldn't sever the memory. I saw him in the curve of a stranger's shoulder. I heard him in the laugh of a barista. I felt him in the rain. I told myself I was healing. I told myself the ache was getting duller. I was lying. The ache was just becoming part of my anatomy, like a bone that had healed wrong. I wondered if he hated me. I hoped he did. Hate was easier than missing. Hate was clean. Then came the call. It was a Tuesday, of course. It was raining. My phone rang. It was an unknown number. Usually, I let them go to voicemail. But something made me answer. A pull. An instinct. Hello? Clara? The voice was female, trembling, older. Yes? This is Martha Miller, Ethan's mother. My blood froze. The phone nearly slipped from my hand. Mrs. Miller, I shouldn't be speaking to you. Please, she sobbed. Please don't hang up. He's asking for you. What? There was an accident, she said, her voice breaking. Last night. His truck. Ideally, on the ice. He hit a tree. He's in the ICU. It's bad, Clara. It's very bad. The world stopped. The sound of the ocean vanished. The room spun. He's been unconscious, she continued, crying openly now. But he woke up an hour ago. He's confused. He's in pain. But he keeps asking for you. He keeps saying your name. The doctor said. They said we should give him what he wants. In case. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. Where? I asked. I was already grabbing my keys. Street Jude's. In Burlington. Please. Can you come? I'm coming, I said. I'm coming now. I drove. I don't remember the drive. It was 4 hours. I broke every speed limit. I prayed. I prayed to a God I hadn't spoken to in years. I bargained. Asterisk. Take anything. Asterisk, I said. Asterisk. Take my job. Take my reputation. Take my happiness. Just don't take him. Asterisk. I ran into the hospital. It smelled of antiseptic and floor wax, the same smell as the school hallway, but sharper, deadlier. I found the ICU. Mrs. Miller was in the waiting room. She looked small and tired. When she saw me, she didn't yell. She didn't curse me for ruining her son's life. She just hugged me. She was a mother who wanted her son to smile, and I was the only thing that could make that happen. He's in room 4, she whispered. 5 minutes. That's all they allowed. I walked to the door. I took a breath. I opened it. The room was dim. Machines were beeping. A rhythmic, artificial pulse. Ethan was lying in the bed. He looked broken. There were tubes. There were bandages. His face was bruised, pale against the white sheets. He looked so young. I walked to the side of the bed. I reached out and took his hand. It was cold. Ethan? I whispered. His eyelids fluttered. They opened slowly. His eyes were hazy, drugged, but they found me. They focused. A flicker of recognition. A flicker of light. Clara. He rasped. His voice was a ghost of the deep rumble I loved. I'm here, I said. I was crying. I couldn't stop. I'm here. You came, he said. He tried to smile, but it was just a twitch of his lips. Of course I came, I said. I would come from the moon. You left, he whispered. You said. It was a mistake. I lied. I choked out. I leaned down, putting my face close to his. I lied, Ethan. I lied to protect you. It wasn't a mistake. It was the only real thing I ever did. I love you. I never stopped. I never will. He let out a breath, a long, shuddering sigh. His hand squeezed mine, weak but there. I knew, he whispered. I knew. You were right. I said. Rules are stupid. The mess is beautiful. You were right. About everything. Stay? He asked. His eyes were closing again. I'm staying, I promised. I'm not going anywhere. I'm right here. I pulled a chair up. I sat down. I held his hand. I watched the monitor. I watched the line of his heartbeat. Up and down. Up and down. It was the most beautiful rhythm I had ever seen. It was better than any metronome. It was life. And as I sat there, listening to the beep, I knew that the old Clara was dead. The teacher was dead. The woman who followed the rules was dead. And the woman sitting in the chair, holding the hand of the boy she loved, was finally, terrifyingly, alive. The recovery was not a montage of easy victories. It was a slow, grinding war against gravity and pain. Ethan did not walk out of the hospital in a week. He stayed for a month. I stayed with him. I became a fixture in the room. A ghost haunting the corner chair. I learned the rhythm of the nurse's rounds. I learned the language of the machines. I learned to navigate the icy silence of his parents. They did not forbid me from being there. They saw the way his heart rate slowed when I touched his arm. They saw that I was the medicine he needed most. But they did not forgive me. To them, I was still the thief. I was the woman who had taken their golden boy and led him off the path. I accepted their judgment. I wore it like a heavy coat, buttoned all the way up. It was the price of admission to sit by his bed and watch him breathe. When the day finally came for his discharge, we had nowhere to go. My old life was a crater. His old life was a room in his parents' house that he refused to return to. We were refugees in our own history. We chose the city. We chose it for the noise, for the crowds, for the blessed anonymity of strangers. We found an apartment that was the antithesis of my quiet, sunlit sanctuary. It was a fourth-floor walk-up in a building that smelled of curry and damp plaster. It was one room, essentially. The kitchen was a strip of wall with a stove that only had 2 working burners. The windows looked out onto a brick alleyway. The radiator clanked like a dying engine all night long. We moved in with 2 suitcases and a box of books. We had no furniture. For the first 3 weeks, we slept on a mattress on the floor. We ate takeout from paper containers sitting cross-legged on the hardwood. It was a far cry from the perfectly organized existence I had spent a decade building. My old self would have looked at this squalor and panicked. My old self would have seen failure, but lying there in the dark, listening to the city sirens wail outside, with Ethan's arm heavy across my waist and his steady breathing against my neck, I didn't feel like a failure. I felt anchored, but love does not pay the rent. The reality of our choice set in quickly, and it was sharp. I was no longer Professor Evans. I was Clara, the anonymous freelancer. I spent my days hunched over a second-hand laptop, editing dry technical manuals, and ghostwriting blog posts for 5 cents a word. I corrected grammar for strangers to buy groceries. It was humbling. It was exhausting. There were days when I missed the respect. I missed the professor. I missed the feeling of walking into a room and being the authority. Here, I was just a woman in a sweater, trying to stretch a bag of rice for 3 days. Ethan struggled too. His recovery was brutal. His leg was stiff, and the cold city dampness made it ache. He couldn't run. He couldn't work manual labor. He felt useless. He was a young man used to strength, used to capability, and now he was limping around a tiny apartment while I worked to keep the lights on. The tension built up in the small space, like steam in a pressure cooker. We fought. We didn't fight about philosophy or poetry anymore. We fought about money. We fought about who left the lights on. We fought about the silence that sometimes stretched too long. One rainy Tuesday in March, the pressure broke. Ethan dropped a plate. It was a simple accident. His hand spasmed, and the cheap ceramic shattered on the floor. He stared at the shards, and then he exploded. He kicked the cabinet. He swore. He shouted that he was broken, He shouted that he had ruined my life. He shouted that I should have left him in the hospital and gone back to my safe, perfect world. I stood by the sink, watching him unravel. My heart hammered, but I didn't retreat. The old Clara would have shut down. The old Clara would have drawn a boundary. The new Clara walked through the shards. I grabbed his shoulders. I shouted back. I told him he didn't ruin my life. I told him he saved it. I told him I hated my safe, perfect world because it was a coffin. I told him I would rather be broke and tired and alive with him than rich and asleep alone. We stood there in the kitchen, breathing hard, the broken plate around our feet. The anger drained out of him, replaced by a raw vulnerability. He slumped against me, burying his face in my neck. He cried. I held him. We slid down to the floor, ignoring the ceramic dust, and we sat there for an hour. We talked. We really talked. We talked about the guilt. We talked about the fear. We acknowledged that this was hard. We acknowledged that we were tired. And in that admission, the wall between us dissolved completely. We weren't performing for each other anymore. We were just partners in the mess. Spring came, and with it, a shift. Ethan got a job at a used bookstore 3 blocks away. It didn't pay much, but he loved it. He was surrounded by stories. He started writing again. I found a steady contract editing manuscripts for a small independent press. We bought a table. We bought a rug. We bought a second chair. We started to build a routine, not one dictated by a metronome, but one dictated by the rhythm of our own needs. We cooked dinner together, chopping vegetables side by side in the tiny kitchen. We read aloud to each other in the evenings. We walked in the park, his limp lessening with every mile. We were happy. It wasn't the shiny cinematic happiness I had imagined as a girl. It was a quiet, sturdy happiness. It was a happiness earned through sweat and compromise. It was the happiness of knowing exactly who you are and exactly who is standing beside you. We didn't have the approval of the world. We didn't have tenure. We didn't have a retirement plan. But we had the truth. A year after the accident, we decided to take a trip. We rented a cheap car and drove back to the coast, to the same stretch of gray ocean where I had hidden during our separation. It felt important to go back, to reclaim it, to show the ghosts that we had survived. The wind was fierce, whipping my hair across my face. The waves crashed against the jagged rocks with a violence that felt ancient and indifferent. We walked along the shoreline, our boots sinking into the wet sand. Ethan stopped. He turned to me. The wind reddened his cheeks. He looked healthy. He looked older than his 22 years, weathered by pain and love. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a ring. It wasn't a diamond. We couldn't afford diamonds. It was a simple band of hammered silver, imperfect and beautiful. He didn't kneel. He just took my hand and looked me in the eye. I don't have a speech, he said, his voice fighting the wind. I just have a promise. I promise to never let you be safe again. I promise to keep it messy. I promise to love you until the tide stops coming in. I laughed, and the sound was carried away by the gale. I pulled a matching band from my own pocket. I had bought it weeks ago, waiting for the right moment. I slid it onto his finger. And I promised to never hide from the ghosts, I said. I promised to stay in the storm with you. We didn't have a wedding. We didn't need witnesses. The ocean was our witness. The sky was our cathedral. We stood there, 2 small figures against the vastness of the water, and we made our covenant. It was a marriage of defiance. It was a declaration that we belonged to each other. And no rule book could tell us otherwise. We returned to the city, to our 4th floor walk-up, to our jobs, to our life. I started writing my own book. It wasn't a novel. It was a memoir. I wrote about the cage of perfection, I wrote about the terror of breaking the rules. I wrote about the student who taught the teacher how to speak. I wrote it in the early mornings while Ethan slept, the sound of his breathing the only music I needed. It took me 2 years to finish it. When it was published, it didn't become a bestseller. It didn't make us rich. But one evening, I received an email from a woman I didn't know. She was a teacher. She wrote that she had lived her whole life by a metronome, terrified of making a mistake. She wrote that she read my book and realized she was sleepwalking. She wrote that she was going to wake up. I read the email to Ethan over dinner. He smiled. That same knowing smile he had given me in the classroom all those years ago. He reached across the table and took my hand. His grip was warm. His thumb brushed my knuckles. "See?" he said softly. "You're still teaching." I looked at him. I looked at our small, cluttered, imperfect home. I looked at the ring on my finger. I realized he was right. I was still teaching, but the lesson had changed. I wasn't teaching grammar anymore. I wasn't teaching how to avoid errors. I was teaching that life is not a test you pass by getting everything right. Life is a story you write by being brave enough to get it wrong. Sometimes, love isn't about being right. It's about being brave every single day.